Two. Okay. Let's see. Unaccustomed as I am to chairing this committee. Mr. Secretary, first thing I wanted to do was just one of the things on page 14 of your report to us talked about increased responsiveness to congressional inquiries as one of the accomplishments, and I would have to agree with that. And I want to thank your department and your staff. In particular, there were several things, and this goes into your notes, have specifics about drop from 5 weeks to 2.5 weeks and things like that. Mine's more anecdotal, but I did want to commend your office and the department. In particular, TSA, I had some, and there are always issues concerning TSA and lines and red team, probes and things like that, but the TSA in terms of responding to me was excellent. Second, on special immigrant visas and dealing with what was a mistake, in my opinion, in the Patriot Act that caught up the Hmong tribe, the Montagnards, and a number of other allies of the United States and sort of swept them into this position of being terrorists, if you will, and then unable to get green cards or citizenship and the like, and your department worked well with our office and with the State Department, and I want to thank you on that. And then the last was also with respect to Dr. Runge and the medical department. And there are other places, but just really do want to highlight those things.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate your doing that.
Now I want to unload on you, and not really. Let's first start and talk about the National Applications Office, where we had a couple emergency meetings, both as full committee and also the intelligence subcommittee, where we are very concerned in the use of the satellite technology and the capacity that has, where we are in developing the legal and the privacy framework, which we've been promised now for months.
As I said this morning, I'm supposed to meet with the chairman this afternoon. We have completed the draft of the charter and all the supporting documents. I was going to discuss that with him, and then we've been, I think, in the process of trying to schedule today and tomorrow a session to brief the committee on this. We basically have a framework which, as I said this morning, first of all, makes it explicit that we are not, the National Applications Office does not circumvent, evade, or ignore any existing or future legal restraints on the use of this technology. Secondly, it sets up a process for reviewing any proposed use of the technology to make sure it complies with the law, and if it's a novel use of the technology, to examine whether there are some requirements that have to be met, like a warrant before it's used, and if so, to require a warrant. Third, to take, although this was always intended, we make it explicit that the NAO will not entertain or consider requests for oral or written communications to be intercepted. That will continue to be handled under Title III of the Omnibus Safe Streets Act and the FISA legislation the way it is customarily. So it should resolve all these issues quite explicitly.
And I think from the committee's standpoint, certainly from my standpoint, we just want to see it.
Yeah.
And so good. Second, and you alluded to it earlier, and I know I've missed some of the testimony, but with respect to the grants, the FEMA grants, whether it's the assistance to firefighters or the SAFER grants and those things, I know that from my point of view, the committee's point of view, these grants are very important for both our law enforcement agencies as well as our firefighters, and clearly your budget cuts what the Congress presented in its last appropriation, and I'd ask you to go back and revisit your budget on that, and that's more of just a statement. Third, National Guard. And we've had a conversation in this committee and with you, the National Guard serving dual purposes. They've been put on the front line in active duty status, yet they have a tremendous responsibility. And in my opinion, the first responsibility is to be at home ready for disasters of whatever kind. And the reports continue to come back that we don't have the equipment. The individuals, particularly engineers and those contractor types that are within the National Guard, are all in Iraq. They're not here, and that there really is a dilemma for Homeland Security in the event some major disaster hits. How'd you respond to that?
Well, I know General Blum, who's the head of the National Guard Bureau, and the Assistant Secretary McHale and others have talked about this. I think my understanding is the percentage of National Guard that is overseas at any one time is still quite a small percentage of the total Guard that's available. And the equipment that goes overseas typically is warfighting equipment, which I don't think we would envision using in an emergency. I'm comfortable in my dealings with the Guard personnel, and both having dealt with them in terms of planning and in terms of observing them in action, that they are fully capable of meeting their missions here. And it's a question we've asked them over the last couple of years.
Okay, last question, and I know my time is up, but assume for the moment that neither your budget nor our amendments to your budget or our appropriations really go through the whole process and are signed by the President. We operate under a continuing resolution till next year. What 3 or 4 things do you think have to be changed from today's budget, the 07-08 budget, on a going forward basis?
Well, that's such a. I really hope that that's not what we're facing. I think the things that we need in a plus-up, we need to continue building the fence, but that's a continuation of what we're doing. I think the investment in cyber is very, very critical, and that's a significant step up. A lot of this discussion has to be in a classified setting, but it's no secret that we have talked about the increased vulnerability of our cyber assets and the consequences to our national economy, not only of the exfiltration of data, but of potentially efforts to disrupt our systems. So I think it's important to make sure that we have in our budget what we require in order to continue to protect the country as we've laid it out.
Okay, thank you. And now I would recognize Mr. Etheridge from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here, and I apologize for being in and out today because we had other committees I had some responsibility in. As you know, you've just touched on it, but I want to go a little deeper into it. Congress created the Assistance to Firefighter Grant Program because we really recognize the role America's fire service plays in protecting our communities, and that basic training and equipment form the foundation for a robust homeland security strategy. I think your department recognized that, and you've spoken to it before. The International Association of Firefighters said that President Bush has proposed eliminating or dramatically reducing funding for important programs that make our neighborhoods, our citizens, and our country safer. I think he's right on the money on this. Since 9/11, we've been asking more and more of our local first responders, as you know, and they've stepped up. They've really delivered not only for natural disasters, but other things. And they'll often put their lives on the line to keep our homeland safe. The administration's budget for 09, though, proposal only funds the Assistance to Firefighters program at a $300 million level, eliminates the Safe Firefighter Staffing Program. And these funds have supported critical upgrades in our first responders' capability in our communities, and as you all know, there's a huge demand for them. Annually, the department receives in excess of over $2 billion in applications for assistance for firefighters grants, which would seem to me to indicate there's a huge need. 2 questions. Number one, what's the basis for these kind of draconian grant cuts? And secondly, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and the continued threat against the homeland of major storms that are much more severe than we have seen in recent years, how do you think the cuts in funding for state and local programs, including the $750 million cut to Homeland Security grant programs and the elimination of the Metropolitan Medical Response System, will affect the ability of our first responders to prepare, respond, and meet these kind of national or man-made catastrophic events against our country?
We're back with this kind of always interesting discussion about what's a cut. I mean, we are funding these major programs. We're requesting funding at the same level we requested in prior years. It's clear there's some philosophical disagreement. I mean, first of all, I take a backseat to no one in my respect for firefighters and first responders. The question is, who pays for firefighting? Is it a local function or is it a federal function? Our fire grants, and we are proposing to fund that at the rate at which we did propose last year, $300 million, are meant to build capability, training, which are directed to Homeland Security. SAFER grants are really sustainment grants. They're maintenance. There are some people who take the view that the federal government ought to simply pay money, it's kind of revenue sharing, to localities for police and firefighters, ordinary garden variety functions not necessarily tied to Homeland Security. That is not what the administration's position has been. It's been.
But, Mr. Secretary, in all due respect, these are not those kind of grants. These are categorical, targeted grants for specific purposes.
But the SAFER grants are really basically designed to deal with ordinary types of activities. I'm not saying they're not valuable activities, but it's not the same kind of capability building that the fire grants are, which we are funding. The second issue on the state Homeland Security grants, again, we are, if you look at our request, first of all, this is not a fully risk-based program. This program awards a significant share of money based upon a fixed formula where every state gets a minimum. We've proposed to fund it at slightly less than the level we did propose last year, but then we've added $110 million in a new program, which would be much more targeted to be risk-based. Here, what the difference is A, do we want to be more risk-based or do we want to be more formulaic? And our proposal is basically to be more risk-based. Finally, there's just a bottom line issue, as I said earlier, about the pie. I have no doubt that if we gave more money out, it would be put to useful purposes. I have no question about that. But what's it coming from? What are we going to take the money away from? There are other things in our department where only the federal government does the job. Are we going to take the money away from those functions? Then the job won't get done. Is it going to come from another department? Then, in fairness to my colleagues, they ought to be heard on the issue of whether they want to lose those things. Every governor I know and all of my counterparts in state government wrestle with the same issue. Many perfectly reasonable requests for money that have to be sorted and traded off against each other to come within the budget. And that's essentially what we're doing here.
Mr. Secretary, I can appreciate that. Having been state superintendent of the schools in North Carolina for 8 years, handling one of the largest budgets in the state, I know something about prioritizing. But the key piece is always, if for those who, we say in the military, for those at the tip of the spear, who are the people out there who are going to be the first responders, if they don't have the resources, and I'll close with this, I went this past week to present a Homeland Security grant to a local fire department, for two, as a matter of fact. One was getting a truck. And normally folks would say that's their responsibility. However, this rural department, their revenue base is $50,000 a year. You and I know what the cost of a new fire truck is. They would just get in the water wagon because in a rural area you don't have fire hydrants. You go out with your tanker of 1,200 gallons. When that's out, you're in trouble. They couldn't crank it. It wouldn't crank. It was 32 years old. So I think that is a great partnership at the federal level. A second one was funds that had been granted by the department to buy equipment for breathing mechanisms this department didn't have. Now, one would say, well, they ought to buy that. The problem is, small department again, an interstate just happens to go through both of these communities. At any given time, they can have a chemical or biological attack on the highway, and guess who's the first person to show up? These folks are. So if they don't have the resources, they can't respond, and I recognize that. Thank you for answering the questions. Please keep this in mind, because I think this is a critical piece. Sometimes we tend to forget these areas out there. Even though they're isolated, interstates move through, rail lines move through, and they, on any given day, could be called upon to do the same thing we'd be doing in, here in Washington, New York, and the other area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Carney from Pennsylvania is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's always good to have a constituent testify here. You spoke about the budget last week, and one thing you mentioned was the problems the department was having managing contracts. You said, and please allow me to quote here, "I am constantly reminded by Congress of the fact that there is concern about our over-reliance on contractors to manage contracts." And that's a fair point. But there's only one corrective. You've got to hire permanent employees to manage those contracts. And in order to do that, we need to have the money to hire those people. Continually trying to punish us by cutting our management budget in order to induce us to hire more people is literally working at cross purposes. At another point, you also talked about cutting our budget for managing procurement. But I went back and looked at your last year's budget request, and you asked for $28.5 million, and you got every penny of that $28.5 million. So I guess I'm not sure quite what we're talking about here. If you're saying you needed more funding last year, did you say that? Or
No, I don't think had 08 in particular in mind. I think if I go back historically over the last several budgets, there was a tendency on the part of appropriators when in meeting the budget number, we'd get tagged with respect to issues involving management. You know, cut the number of lawyers, cut the number of punish the Undersecretary for Management's office. It's been worse in some years and better than others. My point was really more, I think actually we did pretty well last year in 08, but if you go back, it's been uneven in the history of the department. And there is a tendency, when you talk about trade-offs, for people to squeeze the management line when that is, in fact, the line that provides the capability to do all the things we've talked about.
No, I agree. And you requested $42 million this year, I believe?
Yeah.
Is that enough?
The answer is yes. It'll let us do what we need to do. We're building a discipline program to give us the internal capabilities to manage things much better. And frankly, we're getting the experience of managing it better. So it's both additional money, additional bodies, but also additional capabilities.
So $42 million you think's got it covered.
Yeah, it's going to be good for this year.
All right, because we do have, as you know, your statements indicated a lot of procurement issues. And one thing I really want to talk about now, kind of a segue into that is P28 again. I know Mr. Reichert mentioned it many times, and I was just down on the border in January.
I know you were.
Saw it was going down. On a good day, it works 30% of the time. We were hearing from the folks there. That was what they could rely on at 30% of the time of the P28 project. My question is the I got a lot of questions, but is P28 kind of the beta test for the rest of SBI net and using technology for northern and southern borders, or
no?
Is it just kind of a unique thing?
Now, let me tell you what it is, and let me take this may take a minute or two to lay out. SBI net is not any one particular type of technology. It is the plan for deploying technology across the border in a way that recognizes that the challenges are different. For example, part of SBI net is we are continuing to acquire unmanned aerial systems. Part of it is we are going from, I think, 4 or 6 what we used to call ground-based radar, we now call mobile surveillance systems, to 40. Those are in the trucks.
Well, how significant a component is the P28 part of it?
The answer to that is it is a significant component, but exactly how much of the border will be under this kind of a model will depend on a couple of things. First of all, how well the equipment actually works in the environment of the border itself in real life. And secondly, operationally, to what extent it is a value add to other kinds of technology. When I went down last week, I had a really specific conversation with the Border Patrol, and here was my bottom line question. In addition to looking at all the stuff, I said, look, I don't care one way or the other whether Boeing ever gets another mile of stuff to do. If you tell me that this is too complicated, it's not a value add, you'd rather, you think we're better off with a ground-based radar and whatever it is, I'm perfectly happy with that. Now, that's more manpower intensive. If you think it is a value add in some areas, then great, I'm willing to pursue that. If you think it's a value add across the board, that's great too. And I think I'm a pretty good cross-examiner, and I left convinced that it is a value add, not in every place in the border, but in some places of the border. Now, what are the lessons I think that they've learned living with this system for a few months? I think, first of all, there were some problems in the original equipment that was delivered and the people who put together the package at Boeing. And I had some...
Yeah, we were told it wasn't the A-team.
Right, and I had some...
And we weren't exactly far sure
Right.
how far down the alphabet.
And I had
we
some
want.
candid words with the CEO of Boeing about this, and they replaced him, and I think what I hear back is they're happy now. The second thing is I think that because of that initial issue, there was some problems with the underlying components that have been almost entirely, maybe not 100%, but 98% corrected. The second piece, though, was something we only learned living with the system, which is what is operationally helpful and what is operationally not helpful. So there are certain elements of the system that I think we know now we need to make better because we're not going to getting full use out of what it can do. And then there are some things, frankly, I think they spent a lot of time on. And you know something? I'm not sure it's worth it. I'm not sure the value add is there, and we're going to stop doing it. And I can be even more specific. And, you know, Mr. Chairman, I'd be willing to spend a few more minutes, and I don't want to take time
If you
away,
don't mind, sir.
to really lay this out to you. Because I know you're interested in it, and I think it's worth talking
I think we only have one more, Mr. Pascrell, after this, so please go ahead.
I'll give you an example. They spent a lot of time last few months trying to make the common operating picture appear in the vehicles that are out in the field, the whole thing.
Yep.
Not just the map, but the video, et cetera.
Yep.
So I was talking to the agents, and they said, you know, we're not really sure we want all this stuff. I mean, we're not going to be sitting out there in the middle of nowhere looking at video feed and manipulating everything. Just give us the icons on the map and someone radioing. So that's what I mean by operational.
No, I got that. And you know what? That should have been part of the original contract. That should have been, they should have had some input into that whole thing at the very outset, and they didn't.
You know, that
The contract precluded them from having input into that.
you know, that's a very, there's a lot to be said for that position. I asked that question as well, and you may very well be right. I will tell you again, I'm going to.
I'm just repeating what we heard from the Tucson sector.
I mean, I will recapitulate for you. I mean, I just think as part of my, you know, the transition, the legacy is try to unpack for you, you know, what we've learned in this process. The argument originally for doing it the way they did it was the Border Patrol is locked into a way of doing business. Let's think outside the box and have the contractor come to us using the benefit, for example, of what they've seen in Iraq and stuff like that, and come up with a model that works. I think in retrospect, that probably was not the best way to do it. I think operator input earlier on would have been better, but at least I understand what the theory was. Okay, that's a great lesson we've learned. It's a lesson, by the way, that in S&T we're using now. We have our operators involved in the initial project teams on everything that we're doing with research. So, you know, we've adapted to that, and now we have the operators moving at every subsequent stage. So the bottom line is, I think it's a value add. It is not a panacea. And I continue to think that basically the way we're moving, which is to be very practical and operator-driven, and now having a really good relationship with the contractor and the operators, I think is promising.
When are we going to take acceptance? So when?
I think the likely answer is yes. It hasn't been finally reviewed, but I would imagine within the next few days we likely will. All the open items.
I'm sorry, you will review, or you will accept?
I think we're likely to accept. I can't. It's not. It hasn't been formally made, but I'm inclined to think we're going to accept. Because
okay. Now you said it's not perfect.
It's not. It's not.
Well, how?
Because
Can we get how close to imperfect?
Here's what, I think we have resolved all but all material problems. Where there are immaterial problems, we will get a credit. I liken it to, you know, you get a car and there's some problems with the trim, or, you know, maybe there's a problem with the radio or the CD changer or something like that, and you take a credit for it. But both the deputy.
So DHS has a lemon law. Then is that what you're saying?
No, I think we do what anybody does. I think, you know, when I bought my house, in the end, we did an inspection. You probably did the same thing you do. We did an inspection, and, you know, there's some stuff you say, I'm not taking the house until you fix it. And then there's some stuff you say, you know what, I'll live with it, but give me credit. And that's what we're doing here.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. He yields. Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. Gentleman, Mr. Pascrell from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, thank you again for your service, but I'm here to ask some questions, and I hope you'll respond to them. First, I want to get into very quickly, because I want to get into the budget specifically, but We know that the amount of fraudulent documents that people use to get into this country has proliferated. We know from the records of Interpol. And I want to know what money you've put into this budget, and are you cooperating with Interpol to stop? This is an immediate danger.
Let me tell you what we've done in the budget on the fraudulent document issue, but it's not just a money issue. Obviously, we've put increased funding into our border programs and ICE, which include our fraudulent document unit, as well as capabilities at the border at ports of entry that make it much harder to get through. But in addition to that, we've initiated new procedures at our northern and southern border now that sharply restrict the types of documents that can be presented, which makes it easier for our border patrol, our border inspectors to detect if there's a fraudulent document. I repeat again, as I did earlier, I ordered this to go forward notwithstanding hellacious protests from representatives of the northern and southern border communities who are concerned that by no longer accepting library cards and school cards, we were going to create backups at the border. While I understand that's a legitimate concern, and I'm pleased to say that we haven't really seen a backups at the border because I think we've managed this well, my response to them, as it is to you, is it is a big problem with fraudulent documents. And while reducing the types of documents doesn't eliminate the problem, it makes it easier to get a handle of.
It seemed to me, just as in response to your answer, that we're not doing enough, and whether it means spending more money or not, to stop the tremendous increase in these fraudulent documents. People are coming into this country.
Oh, yeah. There's one more thing we could do. I'll tell you exactly what it is. It's not a problem so much at our airports, because we actually, with U.S. Visit and everything else, it's quite difficult to get in with a fraudulent document. At our land borders, what we could do is finish the process of implementing the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, which requires secure documentation. I tried to get that done this year. Last year, Congress voted to compel me to delay it until June of 2009. If we don't get it, if it's delayed further, or if it's killed, as some members of Congress want to do, then we will continue to have the problem with fraudulent documents.
Well, I want to help along those lines.
Please do. I really would.
Secretary, I think this is critical. Now I got to ask you some very specific questions about the budget. When I add up the dollars and looking at the budget line item, and I've done that. And trust me, for now. But on the assistance to the fire grants, which in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania have been cut $83 million. And when I look at the burn justice grants, have been cut in those 3 states by over $20 million. And then when you add in the Homeland Security state grants in those 3 states, they've been cut $136 million. So when you add these numbers together, we don't need to add them together. The point I'm trying to make is, you know the point I'm trying to make. How can these states continue to operate on the basis that what they established as a priority with the federal government, God bless you, the federal government is not doing its part to support those efforts? This is a serious situation here. You can't start the programs, remove the money. You're talking about the metropolitan area, talking about Pennsylvania, high-risk areas, Mr. Secretary. How can we justify the cut of such funds?
Well, I think that actually is a great question, and reflects what in many ways has been the fundamental issue that we've talked about when we talked about grants during this hearing. One of the arguments that's made against, let me rephrase that. The grants that are disfavored by the administration in the budget process tend to be those that do exactly what you suggest. They are grants that are recurrent grants, like hire people and pay them, like the COPS program was 10 years ago, where we're giving you, the promise is made, we're going to give you money to hire police officers and pay their salaries for 5 years, and then at the end of that, the money's going to disappear. And that very easily translates into a program of revenue sharing, where basically the federal government pays personnel costs for state and local government. And that puts you in exactly the bind that we're talking about.
But the federal government got into the business because there was a need.
Well,
but states could not meet that financial responsibility. You can't say that this is a Nixon revenue sharing plan. The very basis and roots of that is quite different than what I'm talking about, what you're talking about with these particular grants.
Well,
the Fire Act, your administration has tried to zero out 3 of the last 4 years. Those fire grants were done before 9/11. They are based on very basic needs within fire departments, as was the COPS program before 9/11. These programs exist whether 9/11, the tragedy happens or doesn't happen. What you're saying here is that you don't agree that they're basic needs, or you're saying that they are basic needs, but the community should be able to pay for them on their own. What are you saying?
Well, I know
which one are you?
I think what the administration's position has consistently been, I think you're exactly right, COPS and burn grants and stuff is not about Homeland Security. It's pre-existing grants that were created with the idea that the federal government was going to pick up law enforcement, some percentage of law enforcement and fire costs as basically lending a hand to the states and localities. And generally, the administration's position has been this: where the federal government gets in the business of grants, we ought to be building capability, equipment, and training. We should not be paying personnel costs and sustainment. That is what should be picked up by state and local communities.
Both of those pieces of legislation were passed with bipartisan support. Both of those pieces of legislation were sustained by bipartisan support, despite what this administration has attempted to do. And I'll tell you what the result is. You cannot tell me, and you're the expert, I'm not, but you cannot tell me that police departments, if we remove those basic grants and COPS, and we don't help many of the municipalities in support of having enough police officers on the street before we get to the 9/11 issue, Mr. Secretary, before we get to those issues, that this isn't going to affect not only the basic issues of crime or violent crime in their communities, but it's going to affect our response to 9/11. What is the result? What is the result? What will you have accomplished since the need was established scientifically? Scientifically, Mr. Secretary, you're shaking your head.
I don't know if the cops...
You're shaking your head. We know we have standards in every state. At this time, 25 states are on the brink of deficit spending. You expect those states to pick up what you're not doing, what I'm not doing?
But I think this is a great philosophical discussion.
No, it isn't a philosophical discussion.
So let's take the COPS
program. This is very practical, Mr. Secretary.
The COPS program, I have to say, my recollection is I would not describe the COPS program as a scientifically designed program. It was, I
disagree with you.
I think it was born out of the program of we're going to put 100,000 police on the street.
No. The president didn't wake up one morning. Wait a minute, Mr.
To wrap up.
Can I finish?
You may.
Thank you. The president didn't wake up one morning and say, $100,000 is a nice number. Well, you know, then you ought to go back and look at the history of it. No, Michael, Mr. Secretary, you've got to go back and look at the history of this situation, of how that program came about. We had a similar program in New Jersey, only the governor took the money and spent it on other things. You don't want to go back to history, Mr.
No, I don't want to do. I don't want to do New Jersey.
Let's talk about what these needs are. They're either real needs or they're artificial needs.
No, but so let me look. I want to agree with you that of course these needs are real. My whole, I think the theme I've made in this entire budget presentation is there are many important and deserving needs. Now, burn, for example, happens to not to be my department, it's the Justice Department. But here's the challenge that we face in putting together a budget. We have a certain amount of money. We have a pie. The pie has grown, but it still has a limit. If I were to say, if we were to go and say, you know what, we're going to take, $3 billion more and put it in to pay for cops and everything, where's that $3 billion coming out of? Am I not buying new cutters for the Coast Guard where the cutters are 40 years old? Am I going to reverse?
I'm not suggesting that.
So where's it coming from?
Well, now that you asked me the question, can I answer the question,
So that's-
respond to the question? I think it's a good question, very good. And I think it's an honest one.
All right.
It's an honest one.
You have
It's called priority.
Mr. Pasquarello, 30 seconds. We're already way over time.
It's called priorities. And I don't want you to respond to this, but you can't. I mean, you carry the water here. I understand your role and your responsibility. I do understand a few things. But the fact of the matter is that the administration has decided that providing multi-million-dollar tax cuts to people in the 1%, this is more than a philosophical argument here, is more important than responding to the needs of our first responders. Because they're the first ones there before, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, God bless them all. This is not good business and not good policy, Mr. Secretary. You cannot defend this. You cannot defend it.
The gentleman's time has
I
expired, and I understand that the two gentlemen would like to enter into this discussion.
No, it's
but
a
the
great
time has-
discussion. I guess, you know, I mean, this will now detour us into discussions of tax policy and whether it isn't better to keep rates low and increase revenues. But that's outside my field of expertise in the committee's jurisdiction.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back. And seeing no other members of the committee who wish to ask questions, we'd just like to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being so generous with your time and your testimony. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those questions as expeditiously as possible. And hearing no further business, the committee now stands adjourned.
Get this in.